Welcome back to the historian's Tome, where we journey through time to explore the greatest civilizations and empires that shaped our world. Before we begin tonight's story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another historical journey. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Leave a comment below and let us know. Tonight we're traveling to the mountains of South America to discover the remarkable story of the Inca Empire. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient tale of the Incas carry you into peaceful sleep. Long before the Inca Empire became the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, the Andes Mountains were home to many different groups of people. These people lived in small villages, farmed the land, and built their lives around the harsh but beautiful mountain environment. The story of how one small group from the city of Cusco grew to dominate millions of people across thousands of miles is one of the most fascinating tales in human history. The Incas believed their origin was divine. According to their most sacred legend, the first Inca, Manco Capac, and his sister wife Mama Oclo emerged from Lake Titicaca, sent by their father, the sun god Inti. They carried with them a golden staff and were given a sacred mission. They were to travel through the land until they found a place where the golden staff would sink easily into the earth. That place would become the center of their empire. Manco Capac and Mama Oclo wandered through the highlands until they reached a fertile valley. There, at the site that would become Cusco, the golden staff sank into the ground. This was the sign they had been waiting for. Manco Capac thrust his staff into the earth and declared this would be the heart of their kingdom. The year was sometime around 1200 AD, though the exact date remains uncertain because the Incas did not have a written language as we know it. In those early days, Cusco was just a small settlement surrounded by other groups who were often hostile. The first Incas were not yet the mighty empire builders they would become. They were simply one group among many trying to survive in a competitive landscape. Manco Capac taught the men how to farm and build, while Mama Oclo taught the women how to weave and keep house. These skills would become fundamental to Inca society. The early Inca rulers, called Sapa Incas, were both political and religious leaders. They were considered to be direct descendants of the sun god, which gave them divine authority over their people. This connection to the divine would remain a cornerstone of Inca power throughout their history. The people believed that their ruler was not just a king, but a living god who walked among them. For the first 200 years, the Incas remained a relatively small regional power. They controlled Cusco and the surrounding valley, but they had not yet begun their dramatic expansion. The rulers during this period focused on consolidating their power locally and defending their territory from rival groups. They built alliances through marriage and trade, slowly extending their influence. Life in early Cusco revolved around agriculture. The Incas learned to master the challenging mountain environment. They developed techniques for farming on steep slopes, creating terraces that allowed them to grow crops where others saw only unusable mountainsides. They cultivated potatoes, quinoa, and maize. They domesticated llamas and alpacas for transportation and wool. These animals could survive in the thin mountain air where other livestock would struggle. The social structure that would define the empire was already taking shape. At the top was the Sapa Inca and his family, the royal bloodline. Below them were the nobles who helped govern and held important religious positions. Then came the common people, who farmed the land and built the infrastructure. Everyone had a role and everyone contributed to the collective good. This sense of shared purpose and reciprocal obligation would become a defining feature of Inca civilization. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The Incas worshipped many gods, but Inti, the sun god, held the highest position. They also revered Mamaquilla, the moon goddess, and Pachamama, the earth mother. Mountains were considered sacred, home to powerful spirits called Apus. The Incas made offerings to these deities, seeking their favor for good harvests and protection from disasters. The practice of ancestor worship was particularly important. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified and kept in a special place of honor. The mummy was brought out during important ceremonies and festivals. People would make offerings to these royal mummies, believing they could still intercede with the gods on behalf of the living. Each mummy retained ownership of the lands and wealth accumulated during that ruler's lifetime, which meant each new Sapa Inca had to acquire his own wealth and territory. This tradition of royal mummies retaining their wealth would later become a driving force behind Inca expansion. Each new ruler needed to prove himself by conquering new lands and bringing new wealth into the empire. It was not enough to simply maintain what previous rulers had built. Greatness required expansion, and expansion required military success. The 8th Sapa Inca, Viracocha Inca, ruled during a critical period in the early 1400s. During his reign, the Incas faced a serious threat from a rival group called the Chanca. The Chanca were powerful warriors who sought to conquer Cusco and destroy the Incas. As the Chanca armies approached, Viracocha Inca and his chosen heir fled the city, apparently believing all was lost, but one of Viracocha's other sons refused to abandon Cusco. This prince, who would take the name Pachacuti, rallied the defenders and prepared to fight. According to legend, Pachacuti prayed to the sun god Inti for help. During the battle, the very stones of the battlefield rose up as warriors to fight alongside the Incas. Whether through divine intervention or simply through courage and tactical skill, Pachacuti defeated the Chanca and saved Cusco. This victory changed everything. Pachacuti claimed the throne for himself, pushing aside his older brother who had fled with their father. He took a name that meant Earthshaker or Transformer of the World, and he lived up to that name. Pachacuti would transform the Incas from a regional power into a true empire. His reign marked the beginning of the Inca Empire as we know it from history. Pachacuti became the 9th Sapa Inca around 1438 AD, and his vision would reshape South America. He understood that to build something lasting, the Incas needed more than just military might. They needed organization, infrastructure, and a system that could hold together diverse peoples across vast distances. He was not just a conqueror, but a builder and an organizer of genius. His first task was to completely redesign Cusco. Pachacuti envisioned the capital as a worthy center of an empire. He ordered the city rebuilt in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal to the Incas. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman formed the head, the city center formed the body, and the junction of two rivers formed the tail. Massive stone blocks were cut and fitted together with such precision that even today, centuries later, you cannot fit a knife blade between many of the stones. The construction techniques the Incas used remain somewhat mysterious. They had no iron tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no written blueprints as we would recognize them. Yet they moved stones weighing many tons across difficult terrain and fitted them together perfectly. Some blocks at Sacsayhuaman weigh over 100 tons. The Incas used bronze tools, stone hammers, and incredible patience. They understood the stone intimately and worked with its natural properties. While rebuilding Cusco, Pachacuti also began the Great Expansion. He led his armies north and south from the capital, conquering neighboring peoples and incorporating them into his growing empire. His approach to conquest was sophisticated. When possible, he preferred to avoid bloodshed. He would send messengers to rival rulers, offering them a choice. They could submit peacefully and be treated well, or they could resist and face the full might of the Inca army. Many groups chose to submit, seeing the advantages of joining the empire. The Incas offered protection, access to resources, and participation in a larger community. Local rulers who submitted were often allowed to keep their positions, governing their people as before, but now owing loyalty and tribute to the Sapa Inca. Their children would be brought to Cusco to be educated in Inca ways, which served both to teach them and to ensure their parents' loyalty. For those who resisted, the Inca military was formidable. The army was well organized and disciplined. Soldiers were divided into units based on decimal groupings. 10 soldiers formed the smallest unit, led by a leader. 10 of these units formed a larger group of 100, and so on up to units of 10,000. This organization allowed for efficient command and control, even in large campaigns. The Inca soldiers carried a variety of weapons. They used slings to hurl stones with deadly accuracy. They wielded clubs with bronze or stone heads. They fought with spears and bows. Elite troops carried bronze axes shaped like stars. They wore quilted armor that could stop arrows and had shields made of wood or hide. Though they lacked steel, their tactics and organization made them highly effective. Pachacuti expanded the empire far to the south, conquering peoples in what is now southern Peru and northern Chile. He also pushed the borders north, bringing more of the highlands under Inca control. But his greatest legacy may have been the systems he created to administer this growing empire. He needed a way to connect distant territories and ensure loyalty from conquered peoples. His solution was to create a network of roads that would become one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Inca road system eventually stretched over 25,000 miles, connecting every corner of the empire. 2 main routes ran the length of the empire, one through the highlands and one along the coast. Smaller roads branched off these main routes, creating a web that tied everything together. These roads were engineering marvels. They climbed steep mountain passes and descended into deep valleys. Where rivers needed to be crossed, the Incas built suspension bridges made of woven grass ropes. These bridges swayed dramatically but were strong enough to carry llamas and people safely across. The bridges needed to be rebuilt every year or two as the grass fibers wore out, which became a communal duty for nearby villages. Along the roads, Pachacuti established rest houses called tambos. These were spaced about a day's walk apart. Travelers on official business could stop at tambos for food and shelter. The tambos were stocked with supplies and staffed by local people as part of their labor obligation to the empire. This system allowed messages and orders to travel quickly across vast distances. To carry messages, the Incas relied on relay runners called chasqui. These runners were stationed at regular intervals along the roads. When a message needed to be sent, a chasqui would run to the next station at full speed and pass the message to the next runner. In this way, a message could travel up to 150 miles in a single day. The chasqui memorized their messages since the Incas had no writing system. They sometimes carried quipus, knotted strings that recorded numerical information. The quipu was the Inca method of record keeping. It consisted of a main cord with many smaller strings hanging from it. Knots tied in these strings at different positions and in different ways recorded numbers. The color of the strings also carried meaning. Skilled quipu readers could store and retrieve complex information about tribute owed, goods stored in warehouses, census data, and historical events. While we have figured out how quipus recorded numbers, some scholars believe they may have encoded other types of information that we have not yet learned to read. Pachacuti also refined the system of reciprocal labor that held Inca society together. This system was called mita. Every able-bodied person owed labor service to the state. This might involve working on construction projects, serving in the army, farming state lands, or working in state workshops. In return, the state provided food, shelter, and clothing while people performed their service. The state also held great feasts and celebrations, reinforcing the bonds between ruler and people. The empire was divided into 4 quarters called suyos, which all met at Cusco. The entire empire was called Tawantinsuyu, meaning land of the 4 quarters. Each quarter was governed by an apu, a high-ranking noble who reported directly to the Sapa Inca. Below the Apu were provincial governors, then local officials, creating a hierarchy that allowed the central government to maintain control over millions of people. The Incas moved entire populations when they felt it necessary. These relocated people were called mitimas. Sometimes the Incas moved rebellious groups away from their homelands to regions where they would be surrounded by loyal subjects. Other times they moved loyal groups into newly conquered areas to help stabilize them and teach Inca ways. This policy helped spread Quechua, the Inca language, throughout the empire and broke down regional identities that might challenge Inca authority. Pachacuti ruled for about 33 years, transforming the Incas from a regional kingdom into the dominant power in the Andes. When he grew old, he passed much of the responsibility for military campaigns to his son, Topa Inca. But Pachacuti continued to oversee the administration and development of the empire until his death around 1471 AD. His mummy was preserved and honored, and his memory revered as the founder of the empire's greatness. Topa Inca continued his father's work with energy and skill. He expanded the empire even further, pushing the borders north into modern-day Ecuador and south deep into Chile. He conquered the powerful Chimu kingdom on the coast, bringing their advanced metalworking and irrigation techniques into the empire. He campaigned in the jungle lowlands to the east, though the Incas never successfully controlled these tropical regions. Under Topa Inca, the empire reached from modern-day Colombia in the north to central Chile in the south, and from the Pacific coast to the edge of the Amazon jungle. It encompassed an incredible variety of climates and peoples, from desert dwellers to mountain farmers to coastal fishermen. The empire now controlled about 2,500 miles from north to south, making it the largest empire in the Americas and one of the largest in the world at that time. By the time the Inca Empire reached its greatest extent, it governed somewhere between 10 and 12 million people. These people came from many different ethnic groups and spoke many languages, though Quechua became the common language of administration. The Incas created systems that allowed this diverse empire to function as a coordinated whole, and daily life for most people followed patterns established by the state. The foundation of Inca society was the Ailu, a kind of extended family group. Everyone belonged to an Ailu which owned land communally. The members of an Ailu worked together, helped each other, and celebrated together. They had mutual obligations to support one another. If someone's house burned down, the Ailu would help rebuild it. If someone was too sick to farm, others would tend their fields. Land was divided into 3 parts. One part belonged to the sun god and supported the priests and religious ceremonies. One part belonged to the Sapa Inca and supported the government and the nobility. The third part belonged to the local community and supported the common people. Everyone worked all 3 types of land as part of their mita obligation. The community land was worked first, then the land of the sun, then the land of the Sapa Inca. Most Incas were farmers. The diet centered on potatoes, which grew well at high altitudes. The Incas cultivated hundreds of varieties of potatoes in different colors and sizes. They learned to freeze dry potatoes to create chuño, which could be stored for years and provided insurance against crop failures. Maize was also important, especially at lower elevations. Quinoa, beans, and squash rounded out the crops. The Incas were masters of agriculture in difficult environments. They built terraces on steep mountain slopes, creating flat-growing surfaces where none existed naturally. These terraces also prevented erosion and managed water flow. They built irrigation canals that brought water from mountain streams to dry fields. Some of these canals ran for many miles, following the contours of the landscape with precise engineering. At the highest elevations, where farming was impossible, people kept herds of llamas and alpacas. These camelids were perfectly adapted to the thin mountain air. Llamas served as pack animals and provided meat. Alpacas provided incredibly soft, warm wool. Both animals were also sacrificed in religious ceremonies. The Incas also kept guinea pigs, which were an important source of protein. Clothing was made from wool or cotton, depending on the region. Women spent much of their time spinning thread and weaving cloth. Every Inca woman learned to weave, and skill at weaving was highly valued. The finest cloth made from vicuña wool was reserved for the nobility and religious purposes. Cloth was so valuable that it was sometimes used as a form of currency and was a common offering to the gods. Men wore simple tunics that reached to the knee with a cloak over the shoulders in cold weather. Women wore long dresses held at the waist with a woven belt with a cloak pinned at the chest. The style of dress was similar throughout the empire, though regional variations existed. The quality and decoration of the cloth indicated a person's status. Common people wore undyed cloth or simple patterns. Nobles wore fine cloth with complex designs in multiple colors. Marriage was universal in Inca society. When young people reached the proper age, usually in their late teens or early 20s, they were expected to marry. Once a year, the local official would gather all the unmarried people of marriageable age. Young people could choose their partners, with the official making the final matches. Once married, a couple received land from their ailu and could build their own household. Homes were simple but functional. Most houses were rectangular, made of stone or adobe bricks with thatched roofs. They had few windows and a single door. Inside there was little furniture. People sat and slept on the floor, sometimes on mats or blankets. Cooking was done over a fire in one corner, with the smoke escaping through the thatch. Houses were built to withstand earthquakes, which were common in the region. The Incas had no money. The economy operated on reciprocity and redistribution. People paid taxes through their labor rather than with currency. They worked on state projects, served in the army, or produced goods in state workshops. In return, the state stored food and goods in massive warehouses and distributed them when needed. If a region suffered from drought or other disaster, the state would open its warehouses and provide for the people. These storehouses were found throughout the empire, usually built near administrative centers. They held dried potatoes, maize, quinoa, dried meat, cloth, sandals, weapons, and many other goods. The supplies were carefully tracked using quipus. This system allowed the Incas to support large armies in the field, provide for people doing their labor service, and protect the population from famine. Education was not universal. Common children learned what they needed to know by watching and helping their parents. Boys learned farming and herding from their fathers. Girls learned weaving and household management from their mothers. But children of the nobility attended schools in Cusco where they learned history, religion, the use of quipus and governance. They were taught by amautas, wise men who preserved and passed on knowledge. Some girls were chosen for a special fate. These were the akala, or chosen women. They were selected when young for their beauty or skills. The askala lived in special houses attached to temples, separated from society. They wove the finest cloth, prepared special food for religious ceremonies, and made chicha, a fermented corn beverage used in rituals. Some akala eventually became the secondary wives of the Sapa Inca, or were given as wives to nobles the emperor wished to honor. Others remained as attendants to the temples throughout their lives. Religion remained central to daily life. Every task had its religious dimension. Before planting, farmers made offerings to Pachamama, asking her to accept the seeds and make them grow. Before traveling, people made offerings to the APUs of the mountains they would cross. During the harvest, there were celebrations and thanks to the gods. The calendar was filled with religious festivals that brought the community together. The most important festival was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, which took place in June during the winter solstice. This celebration lasted for several days. People fasted before the festival, then gathered in Cusco's great plaza. The Sapa Inca himself would offer sacrifices to Inti. There would be music, dancing, and feasting. The festival reaffirmed the connection between the sun god, the Sapa Inca, and the people. The Incas practiced sacrifice, including human sacrifice. though this was relatively rare and reserved for the most important occasions. More commonly, they sacrificed llamas, guinea pigs, and valuable goods like cloth and food. They also made offerings of chicha by pouring it onto the ground. The Incas believed these offerings maintained the reciprocal relationship with the gods. The gods gave life and abundance, and humans gave thanks and sustenance in return. Healthcare combined practical medicine with spiritual healing. The Incas had considerable medical knowledge. They performed surgeries, including trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure or treat injuries. Archaeological evidence shows that many patients survived these operations and healed. They used many plants for medicine, understanding their properties through long experience. Coca leaves were chewed to reduce hunger and fatigue and were used in religious rituals. They set broken bones and treated wounds, but the Incas also believed that illness could have spiritual causes. A person might be sick because they had offended the gods or because of witchcraft. Healers would perform divination to determine the cause and then provide both practical treatment and spiritual intervention. They might make offerings on behalf of the patient or perform rituals to drive out evil influences. Crime was punished swiftly and harshly. Theft, murder, and laziness were serious offenses. Punishment could include death, blinding, or cutting off of hands or feet, depending on the crime. But in practice, serious crime was relatively rare. The Alu system meant everyone was watched by their community. People knew that their actions reflected on their whole Alu, which discouraged bad behavior. The emphasis on reciprocity and the fact that everyone's needs were met reduced the motivation for theft. The Incas believed in an afterlife. The dead were buried with goods they might need in the next world, including food, tools, and personal items. The mummies of important people were preserved and honored. Common people were buried in caves or simple graves. The Incas believed that the dead could affect the world of the living, so maintaining good relationships with ancestors was important. Cusco stood at the center of the empire, both literally and symbolically. All roads led to Cusco, and from Cusco, the Sapa Incas' commands radiated outward to every corner of Tawantinsuyu. The city was a wonder of the ancient world, though few outside the empire ever saw it during its glory days. To walk through Cusco was to witness the power and sophistication of Inca civilization at its peak. The city spread across a valley at an elevation of over 11,000 feet above sea level. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks often dusted with snow. Two streams flowed through the city, marking the boundary between different sections. The Incas had channeled and lined these streams with stone, controlling their flow. Bridges crossed the streams, connecting the different quarters of the city. At the heart of Cusco was the great plaza called Huaycaypata. This open square could hold tens of thousands of people during festivals and ceremonies. The plaza was covered with sand brought from the Pacific coast, several hundred miles away. Around the plaza stood the palaces of living and dead Sapa Incas. Each ruler built his own palace, which became a shrine maintained by his descendants after his death. The most sacred building in the entire empire stood near the plaza. This was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun. Its walls were covered with sheets of gold, and inside stood a massive golden disc representing Inti, positioned to catch the morning sun. The interior walls featured gold decorations of corn stalks with leaves of silver and ears of gold. There was a garden where everything was made of gold and silver, from the soil to the plants to the llamas and shepherds. This magnificent temple demonstrated the wealth and power of the empire and the devotion of the Incas to their gods. Only priests and the most important nobles could enter the inner chambers of the Coricancha. Others worshipped from outside. The temple complex included shrines to other important deities as well. Mamaquilla, the moon goddess, had her own chamber lined with silver. There were places dedicated to the stars, thunder, and the rainbow. Priests lived in the temple complex, maintaining the sacred fires and performing the daily rituals that kept the cosmos in balance. The palaces of Cusco were built with the same incredible masonry that can still be seen today. Huge stones were fitted together so perfectly that no mortar was needed. The corners of buildings featured stones with many angles, each one unique, fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. The outer walls of palaces and important buildings leaned slightly inward, making them more resistant to earthquakes. Inside the palaces, rooms were arranged around courtyards. The rooms were mostly small, with trapezoidal doorways and windows that were wider at the bottom than the top. This design was both aesthetically distinctive and structurally sound. The walls were often covered with finely woven tapestries. Niches in the walls held religious objects or valuables. The floors were often covered with rushes or rugs. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman loomed above the city on a hill to the north. This massive structure served as both a defensive fortification and a ceremonial site. Its zigzag walls were made of huge stones, some weighing more than 100 tons. These enormous blocks were transported from quarries miles away and shaped to fit together perfectly. The fortress had 3 levels of walls, each taller than the one below it. During festivals, people would gather at Sacsayhuaman for ceremonies and celebrations. Not everyone who came to Cusco was there by choice. The city was home to many mitimas who had been relocated from distant parts of the empire. Foreign nobles lived in Cusco as both guests and hostages, ensuring their people's loyalty. Craftsmen from conquered peoples worked in workshops, producing goods for the empire. But all who lived in Cusco, regardless of their origin, were expected to embrace Inca ways and honor the Sapa Inca. The Sapa Inca himself lived in a level of luxury that few could imagine. He ate from gold plates, wore the finest cloth made from vicuña wool, and was carried on a litter decorated with gold and feathers. He had many wives, though only one was his principal wife, called the Coya, who was usually his sister. This practice of royal sibling marriage kept the divine bloodline pure. The children of the Sapa Inca and the Coya were eligible to inherit the throne. The Sapa Inca wore the royal fringe, a red braid that hung across his forehead from a headband. This fringe was the symbol of his authority, similar to a crown in European kingdoms. Only the Sapa Inca could wear the royal fringe. Large gold ear spools stretched his earlobes, a sign of nobility. The Spanish would later call the Inca nobles big ears because of this practice. Every day the Sapa Inca held court, listening to reports from his officials, making decisions, and dispensing justice. He received tribute from across the empire. He commissioned new buildings and roads. He planned military campaigns. But he also participated in religious ceremonies because his role was as much spiritual as political. He was the son of the sun, the intermediary between the gods and his people. The Sapa Inca rarely walked. When he moved through the city, he was carried on a golden litter by specially chosen bearers. People would throw flower petals in his path and avert their eyes, for it was forbidden to look directly at the divine ruler. When he traveled to other parts of the empire, a large retinue accompanied him, and preparations were made long in advance to receive him with proper honor. Life in Cusco followed the rhythms of the empire. When taxes came due, representatives from every province would arrive with their tribute. They brought agricultural products, cloth, precious metals, and other goods specific to their regions. Coastal regions sent fish and shells. Amazon regions sent colorful feathers and exotic woods. Highland regions sent potatoes and quinoa. All of this flowed into Cusco and then was redistributed according to the needs of the empire. The city was also a military center. When campaigns were planned, armies gathered outside Cusco before marching to distant fronts. Warriors from across the empire trained together, learning to function as unified fighting forces despite their different origins. When they returned victorious, they paraded through the streets of Cusco, displaying their prisoners and booty. The Sapa Inca would honor the successful commanders and distribute rewards. Artisans in Cusco produced luxury goods for the nobility. Metalworkers created objects of gold and silver. Weavers produced cloth so fine it seemed almost transparent. Feather workers created elaborate capes and headdresses. Stone carvers shaped vessels and ceremonial objects. These craftsmen worked in workshops organized by the state, receiving food and materials in exchange for their skilled labor. The markets of Cusco bustled with activity. Although the Incas had no money, people exchanged goods through barter. Farmers from the surrounding valleys brought their produce. Herders brought wool and meat. Artisans offered their wares. The markets were places not just for exchange, but for socializing, hearing news, and feeling connected to the larger community. As the sun set behind the mountains, the city would grow quiet. There was no street lighting, and most people retired to their homes when darkness fell. But in the temples, priests would continue their vigils, maintaining sacred fires and watching the stars. The royal mummies sat in their palaces surrounded by candles and offerings. Cusco never truly slept, for it was a living connection between earth and heaven, between past and present, between the people and their gods. As the 15th century drew to a close, the Inca Empire appeared to be at the height of its power. Topa Inca had expanded the borders to their greatest extent. His son, Huayna Capac, took the throne around 1493 and continued to consolidate and strengthen the empire. But even as the empire seemed invincible, forces were already in motion that would lead to its dramatic collapse. Huayna Capac was a capable ruler who spent much of his reign in the northern part of the empire, in what is now Ecuador. He worked to fully integrate the regions his father had conquered, building roads and administrative centers. He suppressed rebellions and strengthened the borders. He expanded Inca territory slightly further north, though he met fierce resistance from groups who refused to submit. During his campaigns in the north, Huayna Capac established a second royal court in Quito. This decision would have consequences that no one could foresee. He spent years away from Cusco, and the northern court became increasingly important. He took one of his secondary wives from a northern noble family, and she bore him a son named Atahualpa. Meanwhile, back in Cusco, his principal wife, the Coya, had borne him a son named Huascar. The Inca system of succession was not entirely clear. The Sapa Inca was supposed to choose his successor from among his sons, preferably a son of his sister wife. But royal sons by other high-ranking wives might also have claims. When an emperor had many sons by different wives, as was common, the potential for conflict was significant. The system had worked so far, but it contained the seeds of civil war. While Huayna Capac was in the north, strange reports began to reach the imperial court. Travelers spoke of pale-skinned strangers who had appeared on the coast, arriving in huge boats. These strangers wore metal clothing and rode on large animals never seen before. They sought gold and were willing to kill to get it. These were the Spanish conquistadors, and their arrival in the Americas was already reshaping the world. The Spanish had been in the Caribbean since Columbus arrived in 1492. By the 1520s, they had conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Word of these events slowly filtered south, though the Incas did not fully understand what they meant. The Spanish had not yet reached Inca territory in force, but they were coming, drawn by rumors of vast wealth in the southern mountains. Before the Spanish arrived, something else came that would prove even more devastating. European diseases, particularly smallpox, began to spread through the Americas. These diseases traveled faster than the Spanish themselves, passed from one indigenous group to another through trade and contact. The native peoples of the Americas had no immunity to these old-world diseases, and the results were catastrophic. In 1527 or 1528, smallpox reached the Inca Empire. The disease spread rapidly through the densely populated valleys and cities. It did not discriminate, striking down commoners and nobles alike. Entire communities were devastated. The death toll was staggering, perhaps killing as much as a third of the population in some regions. The empire that had seemed so strong was suddenly weakened by an invisible enemy it did not understand. Among those who died was Huayna Capac himself. He fell ill in Quito and died within days. His designated heir, a son who had been traveling with him, also died of the disease. Suddenly the empire found itself without a clear successor. The line of succession that should have been straightforward became muddled. Two sons emerged as the primary claimants to the throne. Huáscar, who was in Cusco, claimed the throne as the son of the principal wife. He had the support of the traditional nobility in the capital and the legitimacy that came from being born of the Sapa Inca's sister wife. Atahualpa, who was in the north with the army, also claimed the throne. Though his mother was not the Coya, he had been favored by his father and commanded the loyalty of the battle-hardened northern armies. What followed was a brutal civil war that tore the empire apart. For several years, the two brothers and their supporters fought for control. The war was vicious, with both sides committing atrocities. Huáscar initially held Cusco and the heartland of the empire. Atahualpa controlled the north and the most experienced military forces. The two sides fought several major battles, with fortunes shifting back and forth. The civil war weakened the empire at the worst possible time. Resources that should have been stored in warehouses were consumed by the armies. Men who should have been farming or building were fighting and dying. The complex administrative system that held the empire together began to break down. Local groups, seeing the central authority in disarray, began to act more independently. After years of fighting, Atahualpa's armies finally gained the upper hand. His generals captured Huáscar and brought him as a prisoner before Atahualpa. According to some accounts, Atahualpa had many of Huáscar's supporters killed, including members of the royal family and nobles who had backed his brother. The civil war had ended, but the empire was exhausted and divided. The social fabric that had held together millions of people across thousands of miles had been badly damaged. Atahualpa was making his way south to Cusco to claim his throne when news reached him that the strange, pale-skinned foreigners had arrived in force. A small group of these strangers, led by a man named Francisco Pizarro, was moving inland from the coast. Atahualpa, fresh from his victory over his brother, apparently did not see these foreigners as a serious threat. They were few in number, perhaps 168 men. How could such a small group threaten an empire of millions? What Atahualpa did not know was that these Spaniards had already conquered the great Aztec Empire in Mexico, despite similarly overwhelming odds. They possessed weapons and tactics unlike anything the Incas had seen. They had guns that made sounds like thunder and killed from a distance. They had steel swords that could cut through Inca weapons and armor. They rode horses, animals that the Incas had never encountered, which gave them speed and height advantages in battle. But perhaps their greatest advantage was timing. They were arriving just as the empire was at its weakest, divided by civil war, devastated by disease, and exhausted from years of conflict. Many groups within the empire harbored resentment toward Inca rule and saw the Spanish as potential allies against the power of Cusco. The Spanish would exploit these divisions with ruthless effectiveness. In November 1532, Atahualpa was in the highland town of Cajamarca with a large army, perhaps 40,000 or more warriors. He had agreed to meet with Pizarro, apparently curious about these foreigners and confident in his own power. The Incas did not see the Spanish as a military threat. They were too few, and they were far from the coast in unfamiliar territory. Atahualpa believed he controlled the situation. Pizarro, however, had carefully studied how Hernán Cortés had captured the Aztec emperor Moctezuma. He knew that if he could seize the Inca emperor, he might be able to control the empire through him. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa entered the plaza of Cajamarca, carried on his golden litter, surrounded by thousands of his warriors. He had agreed to meet the Spanish without weapons as a gesture of peaceful intent. The Spanish were hidden in buildings around the plaza. When Atahualpa and his retinue entered, a Spanish priest approached and presented a Bible, speaking through an interpreter about Christianity and demanding that Atahualpa submit to the Spanish king and convert. Atahualpa, confused and insulted, threw the Bible to the ground. This was the signal the Spanish had been waiting for. Spanish cavalry charged from their hiding places. Cannons fired. The sound and smoke terrified the Incas, who had never experienced anything like it. The horses crashed into the packed crowds. Steel swords cut down warriors who wore quilted armor designed to stop stone weapons. The Incas tried to flee, but they were trapped in the confined space of the plaza. Thousands died in the panic and slaughter. Within a few hours, the Spanish had killed thousands of Incas and captured Atahualpa himself. The shock of this event cannot be overstated. The divine ruler, the son of the sun, had been seized by a tiny group of foreigners. The carefully constructed ideology that the Sapa Inca was invincible and divinely protected had been shattered in a single afternoon. The empire did not know how to respond to this unprecedented crisis. Many believed that if Atahualpa had been captured, it must be the will of the gods. Atahualpa, now a prisoner, tried to buy his freedom. He offered to fill the room where he was held with gold once and silver twice. It was a staggering ransom. Over the following months, gold and silver objects were brought from across the empire. Atahualpa ordered that his brother Huascar, who was still a prisoner, be killed, perhaps fearing the Spanish might use him as a rival claimant to the throne. The Spanish melted down the magnificent golden artifacts into bars, destroying irreplaceable works of art to create portable wealth. The total value was enormous, perhaps 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver. Each Spanish soldier became fantastically wealthy by European standards. But Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. The emperor was too valuable as a hostage to let go. In July 1533, the Spanish accused Atahualpa of various crimes, including ordering the death of his brother Huascar. After a mock trial, they executed him. The Spanish offered to spare him the flames, which would prevent his body from being mummified if he accepted Christian baptism. Atahualpa agreed and was strangled with a garrote. The last truly independent Sapa Inca was dead, killed by foreigners in a foreign way for reasons he probably never fully understood. With Atahualpa dead, the Spanish moved to consolidate their control. They understood that they could not rule the vast empire by force alone, not with only a few hundred men. Instead, they would rule through Inca institutions, using the existing administrative structures while placing themselves at the top. They needed a puppet emperor who would lend legitimacy to their rule. The Spanish chose a young prince named Manco, another son of Huayna Capac, to be the new Sapa Inca. Manco initially cooperated with the Spanish, perhaps believing he could use them to secure his position or that he could eventually drive them out. In November 1533, the Spanish and their Inca allies marched into Cusco. The great capital fell without serious resistance, and Pizarro's brother took possession of the city in the name of Spain. The Spanish were amazed by what they found in Cusco. The city's wealth exceeded even their inflated expectations. They stripped the gold from the Coricancha and melted it down. They looted the palaces and temples. They took the finest cloth, the most beautiful objects, anything of value. What took the Incas generations to create was destroyed in months by men who saw only the monetary value of the gold and silver. The Spanish also began to impose their religion and customs. They destroyed Inca religious sites and built Catholic churches. They forced conversions to Christianity. They replaced Inca officials with Spanish administrators. They divided the land among themselves, creating encomiendas where Spanish lords had the right to demand tribute and labor from the indigenous people. The Mita system of reciprocal labor was perverted into a form of forced labor that benefited only the Spanish. For a few years, Manco continued to cooperate, but he grew increasingly unhappy with Spanish rule. The Spanish treated him with contempt, despite his position. They demanded more and more from the people. They mistreated the nobility. They took women, including from Manco's own family. Manco realized that the Spanish would never treat him as a true ruler. He was merely a tool they used to control his people. In 1536, Manco escaped from Cusco and raised a massive army. Indigenous groups from across the empire rallied to him, seeing a chance to drive out the foreigners. Manco's forces laid siege to Cusco, trapping the Spanish in the city they had conquered. For months, the outcome hung in the balance. If the Incas could retake Cusco and kill the Spanish there, they might save their empire. The siege was fierce. The Incas used slings to hurl heated stones that started fires in Cusco's thatched roofs. They attacked the Spanish positions repeatedly. They cut off supplies, hoping to starve the invaders out. But the Spanish held strategic positions, including the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. They used their horses to make devastating charges. Their steel weapons and armor gave them an edge in close combat. Most importantly, they had many indigenous allies who fought alongside them, groups that had chafed under Inca rule and saw the Spanish as liberators. The siege ultimately failed. Spanish reinforcements arrived from the coast. The Incas could not maintain the siege indefinitely because their warriors needed to return home to plant crops. The Spanish managed to hold Cusco, and Manco was forced to retreat. He withdrew to Vilcabamba, a mountainous region northwest of Cusco. There, in a remote valley, he established a small neo-Inca state that would resist Spanish rule for decades. The failure of the Great Rebellion marked the effective end of the Inca Empire as a political entity. The Spanish now controlled the heartland and the major cities. They had defeated the largest indigenous army that would ever be raised against them in Peru. Over the following years, they extended their control over the entire former empire. Local resistance continued in many areas, but there was no longer any realistic hope of expelling the Spanish entirely. The neo-Inca state at Vilcabamba survived as a symbol of resistance. Manco ruled there until 1544, when he was killed by Spanish refugees he had sheltered. His sons succeeded him, maintaining a small independent Inca kingdom. From Vilcabamba, they launched occasional raids against Spanish settlements and offered a place of refuge for those fleeing Spanish rule. But the kingdom was tiny compared to the empire that had been, controlling only a small mountain region. In 1572, the Spanish viceroy decided to eliminate this last remnant of Inca independence. Spanish forces invaded Vilcabamba and captured the last Sapa Inca, Tupac Amaru, a grandson of Manco. Tupac Amaru was taken to Cusco and publicly executed in the main plaza. Thousands of indigenous people watched as the last Inca emperor was beheaded. Many wept openly. The line of Inca emperors that had begun with the legendary Manco Capac at Lake Titicaca had finally ended. The collapse of the Inca Empire was astonishingly rapid. In 1532, it was the largest empire in the Americas, governing millions of people. By 1572, just 40 years later, it was completely gone, replaced by Spanish colonial rule. Many factors contributed to this swift collapse. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa had weakened the empire at a critical moment. Diseases brought by Europeans killed huge numbers of people and disrupted social organization. The Spanish had military technology that gave them advantages despite their tiny numbers. But perhaps most important was the way the Spanish exploited divisions within the empire. Many groups had been conquered by the Incas within living memory and had no love for Cusco's rule. They were willing to ally with the Spanish against their Inca overlords. The Spanish played different groups against each other, using indigenous allies to fight other indigenous groups. Without these allies, the Spanish could never have conquered such a vast territory with so few men. The indigenous population suffered terribly under Spanish rule. Diseases continued to ravage communities. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other illnesses killed millions. The population of the Andes may have declined by as much as 90% in the century following Spanish conquest. Entire communities disappeared. Ancient knowledge was lost as the old people died. The Spanish forced indigenous people to work in silver mines under brutal conditions. The Mita labor system was corrupted into a form of slavery. Men were forced to work in the mines of Potosi and other places, often dying from the harsh conditions, accidents, or exposure to toxic mercury used in silver processing. Families were torn apart. Traditional ways of life were disrupted or destroyed. The Spanish also waged a cultural war against Inca civilization. They destroyed quipus, believing them to be tools of devil worship. They suppressed indigenous religions and forced conversions to Catholicism. They banned traditional ceremonies and festivals. They tried to erase the memory of the Inca past, seeing it as pagan and evil. Much knowledge was lost forever because the Spanish could not read quipus and because they actively destroyed indigenous cultural practices. Yet despite everything, the Inca legacy survived. The Quechua language continued to be spoken and is still spoken by millions of people today. Many traditional practices persisted, often blending with Catholic elements to create new forms. Agricultural techniques developed by the Incas continued to be used. The ancient terraces still supported crops. The knowledge of which plants could be used for medicine passed from generation to generation. The physical remains of the Inca Empire also endured. The great stone buildings, constructed without mortar but fitted together perfectly, survived earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings built on top of them. Machu Picchu, a royal estate built by Pachacuti on a mountain ridge, was abandoned and forgotten by all but local people. It remained hidden in the jungle until 1911, when it was brought to international attention. Today it stands as a powerful symbol of Inca achievement. The story of the Inca Empire is ultimately a story of human achievement and human tragedy. In less than a century, a small group from Cusco built the largest empire in the Americas through military skill, administrative genius, and engineering prowess. They created systems that fed millions and connected diverse peoples across vast distances. They built cities and roads that inspire awe even today. But this empire also expanded through conquest. Many groups were forced to submit to Inca rule and give up their independence. The empire's success depended on extracting labor and tribute from subject peoples. When the Spanish arrived, some of these groups saw an opportunity for revenge or liberation, not understanding that Spanish rule would prove far harsher than Inca domination had ever been. The rapid collapse of the empire shows how vulnerable even the most powerful civilizations can be when faced with new challenges. The Incas had created a system that worked brilliantly for their world, but they could not adapt quickly enough when that world changed. Disease, superior weapons technology, political division, and the willingness of some indigenous groups to ally with the invaders combined to bring down an empire that seemed invincible. Today, the descendants of the Incas still live in the Andes. They maintain their traditional practices while also participating in modern society. They remember their ancestors' achievements with pride. Tourists from around the world visit Cusco and Machu Picchu, marveling at what the Incas built. The empire is gone, but its legacy remains in the mountains, in the language, in the crops that descend from plants the Incas cultivated, and in the memory of what once was. As you drift off to sleep, imagine those ancient mountain paths where Chasqui once ran, carrying messages across an empire. Imagine the great plaza of Cusco during Inti Raymi, filled with thousands celebrating under the sun. Imagine the patient hands that fitted huge stones together to create buildings that would outlast empires. The Inca Empire has passed into history, but on quiet nights in the Andes, when the wind whistles through the ruins, it is easy to imagine that the past is not so far away after all. Sleep well and dream of the mountains where an empire once touched the sky.